Hello and welcome to the program. The crisis in and around Ukraine continues to undermine security throughout the OSCE area. The issue of militarization of Crimea and the Sea of Azov is one of the main topics on the agenda. To talk more about this, we are joined in the studio today by Niland, a political commentator and public activist. Hello and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
For the sixth year in a row, the discussion at the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly has been dominated by the topic of violence and the conflict in eastern Ukraine. How would you assess the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly attempt to resolve the situation in eastern Ukraine?
I think that the fundamental problem with the OSCE at the moment is that, and I should state, I have great respect for the people who are in the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission. I've met many of them. They do an incredible job, and it's an important job in documenting the ceasefire violations and equipment that's out of place and so on and so on. But the main problem that the OSCE has is that Russia is a member of this organization. And the way that the OSCE operates is that they require something called unanimity in order to pass any decision, right? Which means that, therefore, Russia must buy into whatever it is that they're proposing. And in the past, there's one example of when the OSCE changed its rules. And they moved to a decision-making process, which they called unanimity -1.
So minus Russia, basically.
Well, that time specifically, when they adopted unanimity -1, they recognized that Yugoslavia was a party to the conflicts that were happening in the Balkans, and said, therefore, you must not be part of our decision-making in this. But I think the same has to happen with regard to Russia now, because it is very, very clear. There is overwhelming and abundant evidence that, of course, Russia is not only fueling this, not just assisting this, but
funding it and nurturing it.
Exactly. They're behind it. They're funding it. They're supplying it. They supplied and still supply the military hierarchy. You know, those people in eastern Ukraine have never run out of ammunition. You know, it's clear what Russia's role is, and so therefore Russia should really have no role in OSCE decision making when it comes to what's happening in Ukraine and what the OSCE is doing in Ukraine. They also, in many ways, actually undermine from within the job of the OSCE SMM.
But how is it possible? How to implement that kind of thing? You talked about this process during the Balkan War in Yugoslavia. How did this happen at that moment? And is it possible to implement the same process here?
It's possible because there is a precedent, and the precedent is the one that we've just discussed there with Yugoslavia. How do you bring that about? How do you get the OSCE to change their decision-making policy to, again, adopt this unanimity -1? Well, the beginning is by opening a conversation about it, which is exactly what you and I are doing today, right? It's what I did previously in an article that I wrote for the Atlantic Council as well, and you know, it's time already. And when I say that the Russian members of the OSCE SMM have been undermining the mission from within, there was one example of a particular Russian person who got very, very drunk one day and admitted that he was basically a Russian spy. And
that's an interesting way of revealing it.
Yeah, I mean, what they're doing as well is, because again of their involvement with the Special Monitoring Mission, when reports are being issued by the Special Monitoring Mission, it is with the influence of Russia on the way that they're being written. And I appreciate the fact that the OSCE has to adopt a very neutral position. It's not their job to be blaming either side. But also, we shouldn't be having one of the parties to the conflict changing the narrative about how this conflict is being reported.
But that would mean that Russia would have to admit that they're part of this conflict and that they're here, that they're still strongly continue to deny despite the whole evidence that we have.
I don't think that Russia needs to admit it. There was a fabulous timeline and graphic website that was just released. It was put together in cooperation with the State Department and Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It tells the story of how this conflict has unfolded. The evidence is there. Russia doesn't need to admit anything, and they're not going to admit anything either. Sure. We know this, right? But But groups like the OSCE at that parliamentary assembly level need to now be looking at this question very, very seriously and deciding, is that a step that they think is appropriate? And for me, it's long been appropriate. It should have happened already many, many years ago. But the other thing as well is that, I mean, the OSCE has sadly lost one of its members. You know, there was an American, Joseph Stone, I believe his name was, who was killed in the non-government controlled areas. And, you know, people keep talking about sanctions on Russia and the need to increase sanctions on Russia. Removing them from the OSCE decision-making process would be a pretty significant international sanction and highly appropriate.
Now, to focus on Ukraine itself, according to George, the mission to Ukraine for the presidential election scheduled for the end of March is very important. He said, quote, "I think this will be one of the largest OSCE PA mission. Many of our members are interested." So what does it mean, really, for Ukraine?
It's very important for Ukraine's democratic process to get a bill of clean health from recognized and credible observer missions, whether it's the OSCE or other organizations that I know are sending large teams of election observers over here. But it was quite funny. So the OSCE currently have their winter meeting. It's underway today and yesterday. And one of the comments that I read coming out of there from a Russian deputy who's a part of his delegation to this winter meeting was that he was saying that the Ukrainian ban on Russian monitors it undermines or it violates the basic principles of the organization. I think it's just...
It's a bit ironic, isn't it?
Right, exactly. a Russian talking about undermining basic principles, right? Yeah, but it's right that Ukraine, of course, is saying that no Russian should be a part of that, and we don't need a Russian stamp on our democratic process because they're not a democracy anyway, right?
It's kind of strange from a country who doesn't really elect democratically to judge other democracy.
That's the thing, and we have no idea at this point who is going to become Ukraine's next president, right? But when Russians last went to the poll, what were their options?
It was expected.
It was Putin or Putin. That was basically it. We knew what was going to happen. And in Ukraine, democracy is alive. The race is wide open. It unfortunately doesn't have any brilliant candidates in it, sadly. But you know, Ukraine's a presidential parliamentary republic or parliamentary presidential, whichever way around it goes. And, you know, let's hope that in the next wave of elections, so we have, first of all, the presidential election, then there's parliamentary elections that are coming some months after. Let's hope that in the parliamentary elections, we get more reformers who are elected in and who continue to drive forward the change that the country has seen over the last 5 years. And, yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing how things play out, but it requires this stamp of approval, not from countries like Russia, but I know that Canada, for example, is sending a very, very large team of election monitors. I know that the United States are also sending a large team.
So basically, countries who support Ukraine in a certain matter.
Countries that are A, democratic, and B, also support Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine can count those two examples I just gave, and the EU as well, obviously, as great friends and supporters over the last few years.
Now, let's move to trilateral contact group and also the Minsk agreement. Now, on January 28th, the OSCE Special Representative in the trilateral contact group, Martin Sidek, announced a new peace plan for Donbass, which should replace the Minsk agreement. There has been a lot of criticism about the Minsk agreement, saying it's a failed plan, it doesn't work. So what doesn't work in the Minsk agreement, and is it worth replacing now?
Any new peace plan for Ukraine, any reasonable peace plan for Ukraine will start with exactly the same things. It will start with ceasefire. It will start with pullback of heavy weapons. Minsk goes on to continue that illegal armed formations should be broken up. that it specifically mentions weapons that are only used by the Russian army, saying that they must be withdrawn from the territory of Ukraine. So Minsk very much does point the finger at Russia. But the problem with Minsk is that it doesn't have teeth. And I mean, there's no way that Vladimir Putin would have signed up to something or agreed to something that did include sanctions for him not abiding by the conditions therein. So, you know, it is the job of the international community to see what is really happening. And Minsk, the way that I see it, it is a plan to return to peace for Ukraine and to return Ukraine's sovereignty over that territory in eastern Ukraine, that small part of Donetsk and Lugansk that is currently occupied. Is it right to call Minsk a failure? We can see that the war is still ongoing. We can see every day that there are attacks, that there are casualties.
An increase in attack this last,
And they seem to be able to dial it up and dial it, turn it down as well at the same time at will. So if there was an instruction that came from the Kremlin, then there could be peace in Ukraine. But and again, I think that Minsk is a good roadmap to get us back to a peaceful state. But the issue is that Russia's failures to abide by the commitments that were made twice in Minsk, but prior to that in Geneva as well. The first peace plan for Ukraine started out with a ceasefire and et cetera, et cetera. The first peace plan for Ukraine was made in Geneva, brokered by the United States and the European Union. Then when Minsk happened, then it became the Normandy format instead, and it was the German and French leaders that were
involved in the process. Yeah.
Involved in the process and helping to mediate between Poroshenko and Putin. But the problem is Russia has not stuck to the commitments that it made, and the only way to make Russia stick to it is to up the costs. And again, we talk about sanctions.
Yes. But now it brings me to my next question, which is not only about the countries involved in the Minsk agreement, but also the presidents. And I'm thinking Angela Merkel is going to go soon from power. Macron is facing a massive crisis in France. And well, who stays, Poroshenko and Putin? But France and Germany they're not the same leaders that basically created the Normandy format. So is it a problem? Do you see it as a problem that there is no continuity in that case? And might Germany or France just lose interest, let's say, in the Minsk agreement and in helping Ukraine?
Well, as I understand, the successor to Angela Merkel is someone who has actually been her protege and someone who's worked very, very closely with her over the years. So I would hope that there's continuity of thought and style and process coming from Germany. With regard to Macron, you would know more than me, but I've seen reports of late that after a dip in following a year of the first year of his presidency, that he's coming back to higher levels of popularity. But Macron is very much distracted right now by domestic affairs. He's the Gilets jaunes, the problems that they have not just in Paris but around the country. And that again, we can trace back some of the support for the Gilets jaunes, and
we saw images of people fighting in Donbass, basically with the flag of the.
Exactly right, exactly right. And there's reason to believe that we have societal problems, the same in the UK with Brexit and the things that people were angry about that caused them to vote the way that they did. We have societal problems, but in every case, what we're seeing in France right now, in the UK back in 2016 when they had the Brexit referendum, is we're seeing those fans being flamed by Russia, right? And they do exactly the same in the United States right now as well. So, there's more that needs to be done to counter that also very destructive element of what Russia is doing globally. But to my mind, I think that the fact that the EU, I mean, we talk about France and Germany as rounding out the Normandy Quartet, The EU 28, as it currently stands, hopefully remains, 28 member states have maintained their unanimous position on sanctions against Russia in parallel with the United States and other countries as well. I think that that's a very good sign, but after the recent events down in the Kerch Strait, which is, I mean, recent, it's now 90 days ago, I think, something like that. But, you know, that was another very, very obvious moment where people should have said enough is enough and really seriously upped the sanctions and started to expand the list of sanctioned people to include the family members of those who are currently sanctioned, and looked at cutting Russia off from SWIFT and looked at expelling them from the OSCE's decision-making process. There's lots that can be done.
Now, and to conclude this interview, more on a personal note, you've been in Ukraine for a long time now.
16 years.
16 years. You saw the country evolve. Since your Maidan, did you saw a lot of changes, and are you optimistic about the future of this democracy in Ukraine as we know it?
I've seen the country evolve a lot throughout that period. Certainly since Maidan, in the last 5 years, more reforms have been achieved than at any time throughout Ukraine's recent independent history. A lot has been done, for sure. Not enough has been done. But am I optimistic about the future? Yeah, I am. This is my home, and I love this country. But the thing that keeps me most optimistic about Ukraine is Ukrainians. It is what those people accomplished during those 93 days that they stood on Maidan against Yanukovych. It is what those people accomplished in the Orange Revolution as well, which I also witnessed. But the accomplishments over the last 5 years in terms of reform have come, as I said earlier on, from our international partners ensuring that they happen. But it's the double pressure that comes from civil society at the same time.
Plus the international, yes.
The Ukrainian people are simply fabulous, and especially after the last revolution, where the cost was so high, they've stood firm in their demands that Ukraine continues to move in the direction of becoming a European fully-fledged democracy, and the people of this country deserve no less.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure to have you in the studio today to talk about all this topic. That was Niland, a political commentator and public activist. Thank you for watching the program, and stay tuned for the rest.